Welcome to TV, Tennessee Valley Church. Today we're at the Huntsville Revisited Museum, a local treasure, where we can learn, among many things about Huntsville, about the lives and contributions of enslaved and formerly enslaved persons. We're continuing the sermon series that began 2 weeks ago with Abraham and will take us all the way to Easter. We're looking in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, for the presence of the Messiah, for predictions about the Messiah, and patterns that give us hints and foreshadowings of the Messiah's coming. Last week, we talked about how the Hebrew people came to be enslaved in Egypt. A Pharaoh came to power who saw the Hebrew people as nothing more than foreigners and cheap labor. So, he enslaved them. For 4 centuries, they endured the torture, the hard labor, the discrimination, the hatred, the belittling of slavery. Their number was increasing to the point that the Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, considered them a threat. To stifle the growth of the Hebrew population, Pharaoh issued an order to slaughter the newborn Hebrew males. Moses was one of those newborn Hebrew baby boys. So Moses' mother hid baby Moses in the Nile River in a basket, where he was found and taken in, ironically, by the daughter of the Pharaoh himself. So Moses' first 40 years were spent as a fair-haired member of the first family, a privileged prince in a palace. Then one day he stood watching the hard labor of the Hebrew people, whom he knew to be his people. Moses' blood boiled as he watched an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. The passion of his roots took over, and Moses jumped to the Egyptian overseer, and in the struggle, Moses killed him. That's hard to imagine. But let me talk about something I've learned. It was helpful to me when a friend explained the idea of dry wood, like a pile of dry wood. Dry wood that with just a spark can ignite into a giant blaze. Back in 2020, she explained 400 years of history in North America since the first arrival of enslaved Africans in 1619, and the resentment that had been building, making for an incendiary situation. You know, a pile of dry wood. Slavery. Whites-only signs in the windows of restaurants and above water fountains. Voting rights restricted. After 400 years, sometimes one act of injustice can ignite that pile of dry wood. Not that violence is excused. Looting and destruction of property and physical attacks are neither excusable nor helpful. But 400 years of history does help us understand deep frustrations. It helps us understand Moses too. Nothing excuses Moses' violence, but 400 years of his people's history does help explain his passion and his short fuse. Moses thought no one knew. Well, people knew all right. Soon Moses' picture was in every post office west of the Red Sea. So Moses fled to Midian in the southeastern Sinai Desert. We don't hear anything from Moses for 4 decades. Then, one day when he was about 80 years old, he saw a bush burning with a flame fueled by God Himself. In Exodus 3, we read that from that flame God spoke. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them. Let's pay attention to how the Bible says God responded to the cries of the Hebrew people. He heard. For over 400 years, the Hebrew people cried. I can imagine a little Hebrew girl crying herself to sleep because she saw some Egyptian slave driver beating her daddy that day. She cries and prays that God won't let that mean man hurt her daddy anymore. And she drifts off to sleep wondering, is anybody out there? I can imagine a Hebrew father sitting on the floor beside the pallet where his little boy is sleeping. Even he, a man whose skin has been toughened by the sun and whose muscles have been hardened by the labor, wipes away a tear. This is not how he wanted his boy to grow up, in slavery. He pleads silently for God to do something, and yet he wonders in the darkness, is anybody out there? And then finally, God said to Moses, I have heard the cries of my people, and I am moved by those cries. I've come to deliver them. And I'm going to use you, Moses, to do that. The truth is, God really does hear when His children cry. God sent Moses to demand that Pharaoh let God's people go, but Pharaoh was unmoved. It took some divine convincing in the form of severe plagues, the most devastating being the death of Egyptian children. 2 Peter 3:9 says God does not want anyone to perish. Yet Exodus 11 and 12 tell the story of how God finally resorted to a drastic measure, the death of firstborn Egyptian sons. God provided a means of escape for His people, the blood of a lamb. Each family of Israel, of the Hebrew people, was to slaughter an unblemished lamb and sprinkle the blood of the lamb on the doorframes of their houses. God said, on that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, and when I see the blood of the lamb, I will pass over you. Now put a pin in that. We're going to come back to the Passover. I don't understand why God did it that way. The Passover, I mean. It was a different time, a unique situation. And that severe act, an act that brought such pain to Egypt, convinced Pharaoh to let God's people go. After the dark night of the death of Egyptian children, Pharaoh finally relented and told the Israelites to get out. But it wasn't long before he was lamenting his relenting, and Pharaoh decided to chase down the escaping Israelites. He caught up with them at the Red Sea. The waters of the sea divided. The Israelites, the Hebrew people, crossed on solid ground, and when Pharaoh's army attempted to drive their chariots across the sea floor, the waters crashed in on them and they perished. And the Israelites, the Hebrew people, were finally free. The Hebrews' exodus from Egypt is a long-standing symbol of freedom from oppression. In the 1790s, when enslaved Haitians were fighting for their freedom from the French, they drew inspiration from the story of the exodus from Egypt. In the 1800s, in the American South, black people enslaved by white owners sang spirituals like, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." In South Africa, when black people suffered under apartheid, people like Desmond Tutu appealed to the story of the Exodus to give people hope. When Dr. Martin Luther King gave his final speech in Memphis in 1969, he talked about Moses getting a glimpse of the promised land. The story of the Exodus is a powerful symbol. Wherever people are treated unfairly, either by a system or by individuals, there's hope for and need for an exodus. In a few weeks, we will arrive at the first sermon Jesus preached. In that sermon, recorded in Luke 4, Jesus said He had come, among other things, as the Message translation has it, to set the burdened and battered free. Whenever and wherever people are burdened and battered by the selfish policies and practices of other people, God declares, "Let my people go." And whenever and wherever we work for the fair treatment of everyone, and whenever and wherever we work to break down walls that still divide us as races, when we work to free people from the cycle of poverty, and we do that in the name of King Jesus, well, that's kingdom work, biblical work. When I come back, I'm going to talk about something really important, the link between the original Passover in Egypt and the death of Jesus 1,400 years later.
Feeling like I'm breathing my last breath. Feeling like I'm walking my last steps. Look at all of these tears I've wept. Look at all the promises that I've kept. I put my all into your hands. Here's my soul to keep. I let you in with all that I can, and you're not hard to reach. you bless me with the best gift that I've ever known. You give me purpose. You give me purpose. Thinking my journey's come to an end. Sending out a farewell to my friends. For inner peace, I ask you to forgive me for my sins. Oh, would you please? 'Cause I'm more than grateful for the time we spent. My spirit's at ease, and I put my heart into your hands. Learn the lessons you teach. No matter when, wherever I am, you're not hard to reach. And you're giving me the best gift that I've ever known. You give me purpose. Every day you give me purpose. In every way. My everything. Oh, you are my everything. Oh, you are my everything. Oh, you're my everything. You are. Give me purpose.
Huntsville Revisited Museum works to preserve and share the rich history of Huntsville and Madison County. And William Hampton started this museum. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm honored to be here.
William, you like to share all of Huntsville's history.
Yes, ma'am.
And a lot of times that includes the stories that aren't well known.
That's correct.
But the people who still worked to shape this community.
The stories which were left out of the narrative in the beautiful story, which is Huntsville, Alabama. So I like to share those stories of the common people, the everyday people. And some of these people had national and international acclaim, but interesting enough, those of us here didn't know that the roots were here in Huntsville, Madison County.
We're so thankful that you've been working on this.
Yes, ma'am, my entire life.
What are some of your favorite stories?
Oh, well, of course, I always love sharing the story of Dr. William Hooper Council, founder of Alabama A&M. The story I love sharing most, people think about Alabama, think about the South, you think of cotton and tobacco and those other crops, and of course the hot sun. But Huntsville had a silk industry in the 19th century. And so that's one of my favorite stories to share. The story of Samuel R. Lowry. And he moved to Huntsville in 1875. I haven't been able to find documentation telling why, but he was born in Nashville in 1831, and he was born free. And interesting enough, this was during the chapter in our country's history during enslavement. But his father was enslaved, his mother was a Cherokee Indian. So when his mother and father were young, fell in love, and his mother purchased his father and freed him. And so Samuel was one of their children, and they had a life there in Nashville that's interesting in itself. But in 1875, Samuel moved to Huntsville, and he married a woman named Adora Robinson, and her father was John Robinson. He had a livery stable downtown Huntsville. But he eventually founded a school called the Lowry Industrial School. And that school sat on the corner of Clinton and Gallatin, which would be present-day Clinton and Spraggins. And of course, First Baptist Church at one time sat on that very block. But this school started in 1875, and they entered their silk into the 1884 World's Fair, winning first place. And Samuel was also the first black man first person of color to argue a case before the United States Supreme Court in 1880.
Wow.
Colored attorney from Huntsville, Alabama. So not only was he silk industry executive and had founded this school, but he was a minister. He also was a horticulturist, but just a fascinating man. And I believe he died in 1901. But Samuel R. Lowry put Huntsville on the map in addition to, the cotton industry, but we had a silk industry here that was nationally and internationally recognized.
And that's something that most people have no idea.
No, ma'am, not at all. They know the name Samuel Lowry, but many times don't connect him to Huntsville.
Well, Travis is talking today about the exodus
Mm-hmm.
of the Hebrew people. And we have to think that the slaves
Yes.
from our history pulled on that inspiration from
Yes,
the biblical story in their life.
Right.
And even Martin Luther King mentioned the Promised Land.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The night before he was assassinated, he delivered that speech, the mountaintop speech, and he made the comment he made in that speech. He says, "I may not get there with you, but I've seen the Promised Land." And that was the day before he was killed.
William, we're so thankful for you. Every family hopes to have a family member who documents the history and researches the history, and you're that family member for the Huntsville community.
Yes, ma'am.
So we appreciate your work.
Let's return now, as I said I would, to the Passover. That dark night when the Hebrew people sprinkled the blood of unblemished lambs over their doorposts and the Lord passed over them. In Exodus 12, Passover was established as an ongoing celebration. God gave Moses strict instructions about how to celebrate, including what to eat. Every year, the people of Israel would remember that dark and miraculous night when God passed over them and delivered them from slavery. Well, fast forward 1,400 years from the Exodus in Egypt. Imagine with me what it must have been like as Jesus rode into Jerusalem atop that donkey on what we call Palm Sunday. As I was studying that scene this week, I thought of homecoming this past fall at Alabama A&M. My friend Amos Humphreys and I went. There were throngs, multitudes, masses of people everywhere. Vendors, cookouts, reunions. The atmosphere was electric. The football game was almost an afterthought. That's the kind of atmosphere in Jerusalem when Jesus rode into the city that Sunday. Except, on top of all the other sights and sounds, add the bleating of thousands and thousands of sheep. It was Passover week in Jerusalem. When Jesus and His disciples gathered in that upper room on the Thursday night before Jesus died on Friday, they were eating the Passover meal, just as had been instructed back in Exodus chapter 12. The week of Jesus' crucifixion was the week of Passover in Jerusalem. That was neither incidental nor coincidental. That fact was neither unimportant, unplanned, or unexpected. It was anticipated and orchestrated by the Creator of the universe. Let me say that again. The week of Jesus' crucifixion was the week of Passover in Jerusalem. That was neither incidental nor coincidental. That fact was neither unimportant, unplanned, nor unexpected. It was anticipated and orchestrated by the Creator of the universe. The story of the Exodus is not only a symbol of freedom from injustice, it's also a symbol of freedom from the enslavement of what the Bible calls sin. That's why Jesus' death on the cross is so closely tied to the Passover. The cross is the ultimate deliverance, the ultimate liberation, the ultimate redemption. On our own, we are lost and without God. We're born with what the Bible calls a sin nature, which is simply an overwhelming tendency to do the wrong thing. So we are sinners, if you will, by nature and by choice. And we cannot escape that bondage, that enslavement on our own. We need more than a self-help book. We need more than coping mechanisms. We need more than for someone to tell us we're okay and not to worry about it. We need more than that. We need redemption. And here's the good news. Jesus is the great Redeemer. Ephesians 1:7 reads, "In Him, in Jesus, we have redemption through His blood." I want to tell you a quick story, but first we have to get that verse in our heads. Ephesians 1:7, again, in Jesus, we have redemption through His blood. Eugene Nida is a famous anthropologist who's done a great deal of work in Bible translation. He says that when missionaries were translating the Bible into the Bambara language of West Africa, the translators had difficulty when they came to verses like Ephesians 1:7, where they had to translate the word redemption from Greek. And then translators learned of a common practice in days gone by. Many of the ancestors of the Bambara were captured by slave traders deep within the bush. Their captors would place iron collars around their necks and chain the captives together for their trek to the sea. As they passed through villages on their way to the ocean and the slave ships, sometimes someone within that village would recognize a relative among those in chains being taken to the slave ships. If one had enough money or gold, the slave trader would agree to set the captive free. He would go to the captive and, with his keys, unlock the iron collar. Then he would take his or her head out of the collar or the chains that bound him or her. The enslaved had been redeemed or freed. So that's how the Bible translators decided to translate redeem, take our heads out. Therefore, when someone reading the Bible in the Bambara language, when they come to Ephesians 1:7, they read, "In Jesus your heads were taken out through His blood." Jesus died to set us free from the shackles of shame and guilt that we carry around. Jesus died to free us from our sinful nature, our overwhelming tendency to do the wrong thing, so that we could become the people we were created to be. Jesus died so that we could be freed from the eternal punishment which we deserve because of our sinfulness. Now, I can't explain how, but I have bet my eternity on it. I invite you to place your faith with all you have and all you are in Jesus and be freed.
Every table is an altar. Every breath is a gift from you. Every moment is a treasure. Every day is a kiss from you. And every table is an altar. Every breath is a gift from you. Every moment is a treasure. Every day is a kiss from you. So let our hearts be awake, be awake. Let our hearts be awake, be awake. So let our hearts be awake, be awake. Oh, let our hearts be awake, be awake. Break the bread, pour the wine. Let our hearts come alive in your presence, in your presence. Let our fear fall away, let our faith rise today in your presence, in your presence. Every stranger has a story. Every story's being told by you. We're all children on a journey. Jesus, only you can lead us through. So let our hearts be awake,
Thank you so much for watching. It is an honor, and I mean that, to have you as part of our extended community. We know that there are people who watch who are new believers. We know that there are people who watch who have been followers of Jesus for a long time. We know there are people who watch who are just considering the Christian faith. Wherever you are in that, we are delighted that you watch. We really are. And we think this might be helpful. Things I wish I'd learned in Sunday school, a study of the basics of the Christian faith. Whether you might want a refresher, or maybe you would like to sit in the privacy of your own home or room or wherever you are and consider these basics of the Christian faith. This might be helpful. So we want to send you one, no cost of course, no obligation, just email publications@fbchsv.org, publications@fbchsv.org. They'll send you a digital copy, and you can use it however it might be helpful. We just want to say thank you. Thank you again for being part of our extended community.